The Soviet Union lost 27 million people in World War II, yet somehow they crushed the most powerful military machine ever built. Here's what actually happened.
When Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, he expected the Soviet Union to collapse within weeks. German generals told him it would take 8 weeks maximum. The Wehrmacht had just steamrolled through Poland in 28 days and conquered France in 6 weeks. They had the best tanks, the best training, and the most experienced army on the planet. The Soviets? They were a mess. Stalin had just purged 70% of his officer corps. Their troops were poorly trained. Their equipment was outdated. Their industrial base was vulnerable. Hitler called the Soviet Union a house of cards that would come crashing down the moment you kicked in the door. He was wrong. 4 years later, Soviet tanks were rolling through Berlin. The swastika was burning on top of the Reichstag. The Third Reich, which was supposed to last 1,000 years, was finished. So what happened? How did a country that lost more people than anyone else in the war end up winning? How did they turn the tide against an enemy that seemed unstoppable?
Reason 1. Geography saved them when nothing else could. Russia is massive. We're talking about the largest country on Earth. When the Germans invaded, they had to cover enormous distances just to reach anything important. Napoleon learned this lesson the hard way in 1812. Hitler ignored that lesson completely. The sheer size of the Soviet Union meant that even when the Germans were winning, they were stretching their supply lines to the breaking point. Tanks need fuel, soldiers need food. Ammunition doesn't magically appear at the front. Every kilometer the Wehrmacht advanced made their logistics nightmare worse. Reason 2. Winter warfare wasn't something the Germans prepared for. Everyone talks about the Russian winter like it's some kind of secret weapon. It's not a secret. It happens every single year. But the Germans didn't pack winter gear for their troops because they genuinely believed the war would be over before winter arrived. When temperatures dropped to minus 40 degrees Celsius, German soldiers were still wearing summer uniforms. Their engines froze. Their weapons jammed. Meanwhile, Soviet troops had quilted jackets, felt boots, and equipment designed for extreme cold. The winter of 1941 killed more German soldiers than Soviet bullets did. Reason 3. Soviet factories kept running no matter what. When the Germans pushed east, the Soviets did something incredible. They picked up entire factories, loaded them onto trains, and moved them beyond the Ural Mountains. We're talking about 1,500 industrial enterprises relocated in just a few months. Workers dismantled machinery, shipped it east, and reassembled it in the middle of nowhere. Some factories were producing tanks again within weeks of being moved. The Germans could bomb Moscow all they wanted, but the real industrial power was now out of reach. Reason 4. The T-34 tank changed everything on the battlefield. When German tank crews first encountered the T-34, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. Their armor-piercing rounds bounced off the sloped armor. The T-34 had a better gun, better armor, and better mobility than anything the Germans had in 1941. It was also simple to build and easy to repair. Soviet factories could pump out T-34s faster than Germany could produce their more complicated tanks. By the end of the war, the Soviets had built over 50,000 T-34s. Quantity became its own kind of quality. Reason 6. Soviet artillery was terrifyingly effective. The Red Army loved artillery. They called it the god of war. Soviet doctrine emphasized massing huge numbers of guns and saturating target areas with shells. When the Soviets launched an offensive, they would concentrate hundreds of artillery pieces per kilometer of front. The barrage would last for hours, sometimes days. German positions would simply cease to exist under that kind of firepower. Soviet artillery killed more German soldiers than any other weapon system.
Reason 6. The Katyusha rocket launcher terrorized German troops. The Germans called it the Stalin organ because of the screaming sound it made. Soviet soldiers called it Katyusha. These truck-mounted rocket launchers could fire 16 to 48 rockets in less than 10 seconds, saturating an entire area with explosives. The psychological impact was enormous. You couldn't dig a foxhole deep enough to feel safe when Katyushas were firing. The weapons weren't particularly accurate, but they didn't need to be. They created zones of death. Reason 7. Soviet intelligence knew what the Germans were planning. The Soviets had spies everywhere. The Red Orchestra network penetrated deep into German military and industrial circles. Richard Sorge in Japan told Stalin that the Japanese wouldn't attack from the east, allowing the Soviets to transfer Siberian divisions west. The Lucy spy ring in Switzerland provided details about German operations before they happened. Soviet intelligence wasn't perfect, but they had enough information to make informed decisions at crucial moments. Reason 8. Lend-Lease from America provided critical supplies. The United States sent the Soviet Union 400,000 trucks, 12,000 armored vehicles, 13,000 locomotives, and enough food to feed the Red Army for years. Soviet factories could focus on building tanks and aircraft because American trucks handled logistics. Soviet aviation fuel came from American refineries. Soviet troops ate American Spam. Stalin himself admitted after the war that the Soviet Union couldn't have won without Lend-Lease assistance. The numbers back him up. Reason 9. Soviet aircraft eventually dominated the skies. Early in the war, German pilots had a field day shooting down obsolete Soviet aircraft. But the Soviets learned fast. They introduced new fighters like the Yak-3 and La-5 that could match German planes. More importantly, they built them in massive numbers. By 1943, the Luftwaffe was spread thin across multiple fronts, while Soviet aviation concentrated in the east. Soviet ground attack aircraft like the Il-2 Sturmovik became a nightmare for German tank crews. The Germans called it the Black Death. Reason 10. Soviet doctrine emphasized combined arms warfare. The Soviets developed deep battle theory in the 1930s. This doctrine emphasized using infantry, armor, artillery, and aircraft together in coordinated operations. Early in the war, they executed it poorly, but by 1943, Soviet commanders had figured it out. They would break through German lines with massed armor supported by artillery, then push deep into the rear to destroy logistics and command structures. The Germans couldn't respond fast enough to stop these operations.
Reason 11. Soviet soldiers fought for their homeland. This matters more than people realize. German soldiers were fighting a war of conquest in a foreign land. Soviet soldiers were defending their homes. When the Germans reached the outskirts of Moscow, factory workers grabbed rifles and marched to the front. When Leningrad was besieged, civilians endured 900 days of starvation rather than surrender. You can't measure the combat effectiveness this kind of motivation provides, but it absolutely made a difference. Reason 12. The Soviet population was larger than Germany's. Germany had about 80 million people. The Soviet Union had nearly 200 million. Even accounting for territories lost in 1941 and 1942, the Soviets could replace casualties in ways Germany simply couldn't. Every German soldier killed was irreplaceable. The Soviets could absorb horrific losses and keep fighting.
This isn't to diminish the human tragedy of those deaths, but in purely military terms, population size was a strategic advantage. Reason 13. Soviet partisans disrupted German rear areas constantly. Behind German lines, partisan groups attacked convoys, sabotaged railways, and gathered intelligence. These weren't small operations. By 1943, there were hundreds of thousands of partisans operating in German-occupied territory. The Germans had to divert combat troops to guard their rear areas, troops that could have been fighting at the front. Partisan attacks delayed supplies, damaged equipment, and forced the Germans to spread their forces thin. Reason 14. Stalin learned to listen to his generals. In the early days of the war, Stalin made terrible military decisions. He refused to believe the Germans would attack. He ordered counterattacks that accomplished nothing except getting Soviet soldiers killed. But after the disasters of 1941, Stalin started listening to competent commanders like Zhukov, Rokossovsky, and Konev. He gave them more authority to make operational decisions. This doesn't excuse Stalin's earlier mistakes, but his willingness to step back and let professionals do their jobs helped turn the war around. Reason 15. The Battle of Moscow showed the Wehrmacht could be stopped. In December 1941, the Germans were at the gates of Moscow. They could see the Kremlin towers with binoculars. Then the Soviets launched a counteroffensive using fresh Siberian troops. The Germans were exhausted, frozen, and overextended. The Red Army pushed them back over 100 kilometers. This was the first major German defeat of the war. It shattered the myth of German invincibility and proved the Wehrmacht could bleed.
Reason 16. The Battle of Stalingrad broke the German army psychologically. Stalingrad was hell on earth. The fighting lasted 5 months. Every building became a fortress. Every street was contested. The Germans thought they could take the city by sheer force. Instead, they got trapped. The Soviets surrounded the German Sixth Army and cut them off from supplies. Over 90,000 German soldiers surrendered in February 1943. This was the first time an entire German army had capitulated. The psychological impact on both sides was enormous. Reason 17. The Battle of Kursk destroyed German offensive power forever. In July 1943, the Germans launched one final massive offensive at Kursk. They concentrated their best divisions, their newest tanks, and their most experienced crews. The Soviets knew it was coming thanks to intelligence. They built defensive lines dozens of kilometers deep. When the Germans attacked, they ran into minefields, anti-tank guns, and prepared positions. The battle lasted for weeks. The Germans gained almost nothing and lost tanks they couldn't replace. After Kursk, the Wehrmacht never launched another strategic offensive in the east. Soviet tank production outpaced German production by a massive margin. In 1942, the Soviets produced 24,000 tanks. Germany produced 9,000. In 1943, the Soviets produced 24,000 tanks. Germany produced 12,000. The gap kept growing. Soviet tanks were simpler and faster to build. German tanks were over-engineered and required precision parts that took time to manufacture. On paper, German tanks were often better. In practice, Soviet numbers overwhelmed them. The Soviet labor force included millions of women. Soviet women worked in factories, drove trucks, flew combat aircraft, and served as snipers. Nearly 1 million women served in the Red Army in various roles. This expanded the available workforce beyond what Germany could match. German society was more traditional, and didn't mobilize women to the same extent until much later in the war. The Soviets used every available person to support the war effort from day one. Soviet snipers terrorized German troops. Snipers like Vasily Zaitsev became legends. Soviet sniper schools trained thousands of marksmen who specialized in picking off German officers and machine gunners. The psychological impact of snipers was huge. German soldiers couldn't relax even in supposedly safe areas. A single sniper could paralyze an entire sector. Soviet commanders used snipers to disrupt German operations and kill valuable, experienced personnel.
Reason 21. The Soviet rail system kept supplies moving. Railways were the backbone of Soviet logistics. The Soviets built thousands of kilometers of new track during the war. They operated trains under bombardment. They repaired damaged lines within hours. The Germans relied heavily on roads, which turned to mud during spring and fall. Soviet trains kept running regardless of weather. This logistical advantage meant Soviet troops had ammunition and food when they needed it. Reason 22. Soviet engineers excelled at river crossings and fortifications. The Red Army became experts at crossing rivers under fire. Engineers would prepare pontoon bridges or ferry equipment, while infantry secured bridgeheads. On defense, Soviet engineers built elaborate trench systems, minefields, and anti-tank obstacles. The defensive lines at Kursk were engineering marvels. The Germans had to fight through multiple prepared positions, bleeding strength with each line they tried to break. Reason 25. Soviet commanders learned from their mistakes. The Red Army of 1941 was not the Red Army of 1944. Soviet officers studied German tactics and adapted. They developed their own methods for breakthrough operations. They learned how to coordinate complex multi-army offensives. Junior officers gained experience and got promoted based on competence rather than political connections. By the end of the war, the Red Army was arguably the most experienced land force in the world. Reason 26. German resources were divided across multiple fronts. Germany was fighting in North Africa, defending Italy, occupying half of Europe, and dealing with strategic bombing. The Eastern Front was the most important theater, but it wasn't the only one. Every German division in France or Italy was a division that couldn't fight in the East. The Soviets faced the bulk of the German military, but they didn't face all of it. The Western Allies drew off just enough German strength to matter.
Reason 27. The Soviet medical system kept soldiers returning to the front. Soviet military medicine was surprisingly effective. Field hospitals were close to the front lines. Wounded soldiers received quick treatment. The survival rate for wounded Soviet soldiers was higher than people expect. Many soldiers who would have died in previous wars survived and returned to duty. This helped maintain unit strength and preserved experienced personnel. Reason 28. The Soviet propaganda maintained morale despite horrific casualties. The Soviet propaganda machine was powerful. Radio broadcasts, newspapers, and posters emphasized patriotic themes and demonized the enemy. Stories of heroic defenders inspired troops and civilians. The message was simple: fight or die. German atrocities in occupied territories made it clear what would happen if the Soviets lost. This wasn't subtle, but it was effective in maintaining determination. Reason 32. The Soviets captured and used massive amounts of German equipment. Whenever the Germans retreated, they left behind equipment. The Soviets captured thousands of vehicles, artillery pieces, and small arms. They turned this captured equipment against its former owners. Soviet troops used German trucks when their own weren't available. They fired German artillery shells from captured guns. This supplemented Soviet production and reduced the burden on their logistics. Reason 31. The Soviet night operations gave them a tactical advantage. The Red Army became proficient at night attacks.
German forces struggled to coordinate in darkness and relied heavily on established defensive positions. Soviet troops would infiltrate German lines at night, bypassing strongpoints and attacking command posts. These operations disrupted German sleep schedules, wore down morale, and created chaos in the rear areas. Reason 32. The Soviet maskirovka deceived German intelligence repeatedly. Maskirovka is the Russian term for military deception. The Soviets were masters at it. They would build dummy tanks and aircraft to make forces appear stronger. They would hide real concentrations of troops and armor. They would create fake radio traffic to suggest activity where none existed. German intelligence was constantly wrong about Soviet strength and intentions. This allowed the Soviets to achieve surprise in major offensives.
Reason 33. The Soviet training system eventually produced quality soldiers. Early in the war, Soviet training was rushed and inadequate. New recruits would arrive at the front barely knowing how to use their weapons. But as the war progressed, the training system improved. Soldiers received better instruction. They practiced tactics. They learned to use cover and coordinate with supporting units. By 1944, the average Soviet soldier was far better trained than his counterpart in 1941. Reason 34. Soviet logistics improved dramatically over time. The Red Army started the war with a logistics system designed for fighting near Soviet borders. When they began pushing west, they had to develop new methods for supplying armies on the offensive. American trucks helped enormously, but Soviet logisticians also became better at planning, pre-positioning supplies, and managing distribution. This allowed them to sustain major offensives over longer distances. Reason 35. The Stavka coordinated operations across massive fronts. The Stavka was the Soviet High Command. By the middle of the war, they were planning and coordinating operations involving millions of soldiers across thousands of kilometers. This required sophisticated planning and communications. The Soviets developed the ability to launch simultaneous offensives in different sectors, preventing the Germans from.
Reason 33. The Soviet training system eventually produced quality soldiers. Early in the war, Soviet training was rushed and inadequate. New recruits would arrive at the front barely knowing how to use their weapons. But as the war progressed, the training system improved. Soldiers received better instruction. They practiced tactics. They learned to use cover and coordinate with supporting units. By 1944, the average Soviet soldier was far better trained than his counterpart in 1941. Reason 34. Soviet logistics improved dramatically over time. The Red Army started the war with a logistics system designed for fighting near Soviet borders. When they began pushing west, they had to develop new methods for supplying armies on the offensive. American trucks helped enormously. But Soviet logisticians also became better at planning, pre-positioning supplies, and managing distribution. This allowed them to sustain major offensives over longer distances. Reason 35. The Stavka coordinated operations across massive fronts. The Stavka was the Soviet High Command. By the middle of the war, they were planning and coordinating operations involving millions of soldiers across thousands of kilometers. This required sophisticated planning and communications. The Soviets developed the ability to launch simultaneous offensives in different sectors, preventing the Germans from shifting reserves to threatened areas. This operational coordination was a key factor in Soviet success. Reason 36. The Soviet industry produced enough weapons to equip their massive army. The numbers are staggering. The Soviets produced over 100,000 tanks and self-propelled guns during the war. They made over 150,000 aircraft. They manufactured millions of rifles and machine guns. They produced billions of artillery shells. This industrial output was the foundation of Soviet military power. You can have the best tactics in the world, but if your soldiers don't have weapons, you lose. Reason 37. The Soviet air defense system protected key industrial areas. Soviet anti-aircraft guns and fighter units defended factories, rail yards, and cities from German air attacks. While the Luftwaffe did cause damage, they never came close to shutting down Soviet production. The air defense system forced German bombers to fly at higher altitudes, reducing accuracy. Fighter units shot down German aircraft faster than they could be replaced on the Eastern Front. Reason 38. Soviet cavalry units remained useful for reconnaissance and raids. While tanks dominated the battlefield, cavalry still had a role. Soviet cavalry could move through terrain where vehicles couldn't go. They conducted reconnaissance, raided supply lines, and exploited breakthroughs. In the vast spaces of the Eastern Front, cavalry units filled gaps that mechanized forces left open. They weren't decisive, but they added flexibility to Soviet operations. Reason 39. The Soviet submarine fleet disrupted German supply lines in the Baltic. Soviet submarines weren't as famous as German U-boats, but they sank hundreds of German ships in the Baltic Sea. This disrupted iron ore shipments from Sweden and complicated German naval logistics. The submarines forced Germany to divert resources to escort vessels and coastal defense, resources that could have been used elsewhere. Reason 40. Soviet Marines conducted amphibious operations when necessary. Soviet naval infantry, often called Marines, conducted landings to outflank German positions. These weren't D-Day scale operations, but they didn't need to be. Small amphibious assaults behind German lines created tactical crises that forced the Germans to pull back or risk encirclement. Soviet Marines also defended naval bases and conducted raids on German coastal positions.
Reason 41. The Soviet rail-mounted artillery bombarded German positions from long range. The Soviets mounted heavy guns on railway cars, creating mobile artillery platforms. These guns could fire from dozens of kilometers away, hitting German supply depots and headquarters. The railway mounts allowed the guns to be moved to different sectors as needed. German counter-battery fire had trouble locating them because they would fire a few salvos and then relocate. Reason 42. Soviet camouflage discipline improved battlefield survivability. Soviet troops became experts at concealment. They would camouflage positions with local vegetation, use terrain to maximum advantage, and avoid giving away their locations. This made it harder for German aircraft and artillery to target Soviet forces. Units that maintained good camouflage discipline suffered fewer casualties and preserved their strength for actual combat. Reason 43. The Soviet Signal Corps maintained communications under difficult conditions. Reliable communications are critical in modern warfare. Soviet signal troops laid telephone wire under bombardment, operated radio sets in extreme cold, and maintained communications even during rapid advances. When wire connections were cut, they switched to radio. When radios failed, they used messengers. This communication network allowed Soviet commanders to coordinate complex operations. Reason 44. The Soviet anti-tank weapons evolved to counter German armor. Early Soviet anti-tank guns struggled against German tanks, but by mid-war, the Soviets fielded weapons like the Zis-3 field gun and specialized anti-tank rifles. They also developed close assault tactics, where infantry would attack tanks with grenades and Molotov cocktails.
Soviet anti-tank defenses became layered and deadly. German tanks that broke through one line would be destroyed by the next. Reason 45. The Soviet motorcycle and sidecar units provided mobility. Soviet motorcycle troops performed reconnaissance, carried messages, and transported small teams quickly. They could navigate rough roads that would bog down trucks. These units weren't glamorous, but they added flexibility to Soviet operations. In the fluid warfare of 1944 and 1945, this mobility helped Soviet commanders react to changing situations. Reason 46. The Soviet military tribunals maintained discipline through fear. This is another dark aspect. Soviet military tribunals executed soldiers for cowardice or retreat without orders. Blocking detachments would shoot soldiers who ran. Order 227, not one step back, made it clear that unauthorized retreat meant death. This brutal discipline kept units in position, even in hopeless situations. It's impossible to say whether this actually improved combat effectiveness or just caused unnecessary deaths, but Soviet commanders believed it was necessary. Reason 47. The Soviet aviation industry produced specialized aircraft for specific missions. Ground attack aircraft were heavily armored but slow. Fighters were fast and maneuverable but lightly armed. Bombers were simple and built in large numbers. This specialization allowed Soviet factories to produce aircraft efficiently. Pilots trained on simpler aircraft and could become effective more quickly.
Reason 48. Soviet military doctrine emphasized breakthrough and exploitation. Soviet offensive doctrine called for concentrating overwhelming force at a single point, breaking through enemy lines and then exploiting deep into the rear. This wasn't subtle. The Germans could often see where the Soviets would attack, but the sheer weight of the assault was impossible to stop. Once through, Soviet mobile forces would race forward, surrounding German units and cutting supply lines. Reason 49. The Soviet conscription system mobilized the entire male population. Every able-bodied man was subject to military service. The Soviets could call up new conscripts continuously throughout the war. This kept units at or near strength despite casualties. Germany also had conscription, but the Soviet Union's larger population meant they could sustain higher losses. This isn't a pleasant reality, but it was a major factor in their ability to maintain offensive operations. Reason 50. The Soviet veterans passed experience to new soldiers. Units would rotate experienced soldiers to training commands where they would teach recruits. These veterans had survived combat and knew what worked. Their practical knowledge was invaluable. A recruit trained by a combat veteran learned things no textbook could teach. This informal knowledge transfer improved the quality of Soviet forces over time. Reason 51. The Soviet salvage and repair system kept equipment operational. Damaged tanks and vehicles were recovered from battlefields, repaired, and returned to service. Soviet repair depots could rebuild tanks from salvaged parts. This was less glamorous than production, but equally important. A repaired tank was available weeks faster than a newly built one. Soviet attention to repair and salvage extended the life of their equipment and maintained force strength. Reason 52. Soviet radio broadcasts disrupted German morale. Soviet propaganda broadcasts in German targeted Wehrmacht soldiers. They described defeats, mentioned names of captured soldiers, and played music from home. These broadcasts reminded German soldiers that they were far from home fighting a losing war. Some German units forbade listening to Soviet radio, which suggests it was having an effect. The psychological warfare wasn't decisive, but it chipped away at German morale. Reason 53. The Soviet winter offensive of 1941 to 1942 saved Moscow. After halting the Germans in December 1941, the Soviets launched a winter counteroffensive along a huge front. This wasn't just at Moscow. Soviet forces attacked in multiple sectors, pushing the Germans back and disrupting their defensive positions. The offensive exhausted both sides, but it eliminated the immediate threat to Moscow and forced the Germans to retreat in winter conditions, which caused enormous casualties. Reason 54. The Soviet partisan coordination with regular forces multiplied effectiveness. By 1943, partisan groups were receiving radio sets and coordinating their operations with Red Army offensives. When the Soviets attacked, partisans would sabotage railways and attack German rear areas, preventing reinforcements from reaching the front. This coordination turned partisan harassment into a strategic weapon. The Germans had to fight enemies on both sides of their lines.
Reason 55. The Battle of Bagration destroyed Army Group Center. Operation Bagration in June 1944 was the Soviet equivalent of D-Day in terms of scale. The Soviets attacked Army Group Center with overwhelming force. German defenses collapsed. Entire divisions were surrounded and destroyed. In 6 weeks, the Soviets advanced 600 kilometers and destroyed 28 German divisions. This was one of the most devastating defeats in German military history. Reason 56. Soviet multiple rocket launchers created instant firepower. The Katyusha and similar systems allowed the Soviets to rapidly concentrate firepower without moving heavy artillery. A single truck with rockets could deliver as much explosive as a battalion of howitzers in a fraction of the time. These systems were simple, cheap, and effective. The trade-off was accuracy, but when you're saturating an area, precision becomes less important. Reason 57. The Soviet emphasis on shock armies created breakthrough capability. Shock armies were formations concentrated for offensive operations. They included extra artillery, engineer units, and tank brigades. When the Soviets wanted to break through German lines, they would commit a shock army. These formations had the firepower and mass to rupture even prepared defensive positions. Once the breakthrough was achieved, mobile forces would exploit through the gap. Reason 58. The Soviet military schools trained officers throughout the war. Unlike Germany, which couldn't replace experienced officers easily, the Soviets maintained military academies that graduated new officers continuously. These weren't always high quality, especially early in the war, but the system ensured that units had leaders. As the war progressed, the academies improved their curriculum based on combat experience. Soviet officer quality increased throughout the war. Reason 59. The Soviet system of military decorations motivated soldiers. Soviet soldiers could earn medals and the title Hero of the Soviet Union for exceptional bravery. These decorations came with tangible benefits, like extra rations and pay. More importantly, they provided recognition and prestige. Soldiers would take extraordinary risks to earn decorations. This system channeled natural human desire for recognition into military effectiveness. Reason 60. The Soviet fighter pilots eventually matched German aces. Early in the war, German pilots had kill ratios of 10-1 or 20-1. But Soviet pilots improved. They learned German tactics and developed counters. Pilots like Ivan Kozhedub scored over 60 victories. By 1944, Soviet fighter pilots were competitive with their German counterparts. The difference was that the Soviets had more planes and more pilots, while German veterans were being killed and couldn't be replaced. Reason 61. The Soviet emphasis on Guards units created elite formations. Units that distinguished themselves in combat were designated Guards units. This came with better pay, better equipment, and prestige. Guards units were used for the most difficult missions because they were more reliable. This created a two-tier system where the best units got better and regular units aspired to Guard status. The competition for designation motivated units to perform well in combat.
Reason 62. Soviet combat engineers cleared obstacles under fire. Engineer units were integral to Soviet offensive operations. They cleared minefields, built bridges, and demolished fortifications while being shot at. These soldiers had some of the most dangerous jobs in the war, but their work was essential. Soviet attacks would have stalled repeatedly without engineers clearing paths through German defenses. The casualty rates in engineer units were horrific, but their contribution was vital. Reason 63. The Soviet mortar units provided responsive indirect fire. Mortars were simple weapons that could be carried by infantry and used quickly. Soviet doctrine emphasized using mortars at the company and battalion level for immediate fire support. When Soviet infantry encountered a German position, they could call for mortar fire within minutes. This responsive firepower compensated for the lack of radios in many units and gave Soviet infantry a significant advantage in small unit combat. Reason 64. The Soviet tank riders created mechanized infantry tactics. Soviet tanks would carry infantry soldiers on their hulls, allowing infantry to keep up with armored advances. This was dangerous for the infantry, who were exposed to fire, but it allowed combined arms operations in terrain without enough trucks for all the infantry. Tank riders would dismount to clear obstacles or attack anti-tank positions, then remount and continue the advance. This improvised tactic became standard Soviet procedure. Reason 65. The Soviet aviation maintenance system kept planes flying. Soviet aircraft were designed for easy maintenance. Mechanics could work on engines in harsh conditions with limited tools. Damaged planes were repaired quickly and returned to service. The Soviets accepted lower reliability in exchange for easier maintenance. A plane that needed simple repairs after every few flights was better than a complex plane that required specialized tools and parts that might not be available. Reason 66. The Soviet river flotillas supported operations near waterways. The Soviets operated armed riverboats on major rivers. These vessels provided fire support, transported supplies, and evacuated wounded. River flotillas weren't glamorous, but they gave Soviet forces additional flexibility in riverine terrain. The boats could operate in shallow water where seagoing vessels couldn't reach, extending Soviet capabilities into areas where road and rail networks were limited. Reason 67. The Soviet system of political officers maintained ideological control. Political officers ensured troops remained ideologically reliable and motivated. They conducted political education, censored mail, and reported on morale. Their effectiveness varied, but they added another layer of oversight that discouraged defeatism or defection. By the middle of the war, political officers were also responsible for explaining why soldiers were fighting and maintaining determination during difficult periods.
Reason 68. Soviet women served as military pilots in combat roles. The Soviet Union formed 3 aviation regiments staffed entirely by women. These pilots flew night bombers, fighters, and ground attack aircraft. They accumulated thousands of combat missions and dozens of confirmed kills. German soldiers initially dismissed them, but quickly learned to respect their effectiveness. The use of women in combat roles expanded the available pool of trained personnel. Reason 69. The Soviet approach to urban warfare evolved into a science. After Stalingrad, Soviet commanders understood urban warfare better than anyone else. They developed tactics for clearing buildings, using sewers for movement, and coordinating infantry with supporting weapons in confined spaces. When Soviet forces reached cities in Eastern Europe and Germany, they applied these lessons. Urban combat is always costly, but Soviet methods minimized casualties while maximizing effectiveness. Reason 70. The Soviet military artists documented the war and inspired soldiers. Combat artists traveled with Soviet units, creating drawings and paintings of battles. These images appeared in newspapers and posters. They provided visual records of the war and created powerful propaganda. Images of heroic defenders or victorious advances reinforced the narrative that the Soviets were winning. This cultural documentation contributed to maintaining morale and national unity. Reason 72. The Soviet military medical training program produced thousands of medics. Every Soviet unit had medical personnel who could provide first aid and evacuate wounded soldiers. Many of these medics were women. They would crawl into the battlefield under fire to drag wounded soldiers to safety. The survival rate for soldiers who reached a medical station was surprisingly high. Soviet military medicine wasn't as advanced as German medicine, but the system was effective at preserving lives. Reason 73. The Soviet chemical warfare preparation never needed to be used. Both sides possessed chemical weapons, but didn't use them on the Eastern Front. The Soviets maintained chemical warfare units and protective equipment in case the Germans used gas. This preparation forced Germany to maintain their own defensive capabilities, diverting resources. The mutual deterrence of chemical weapons prevented a horrific escalation that would have made an already brutal war even worse.
Reason 74. Soviet military music and songs maintained morale. Soviet military bands and singers performed for troops. Songs like Katyusha became iconic. Music provided entertainment, boosted morale, and created shared cultural experiences. Soldiers would sing while marching or during breaks in combat. This might seem trivial, but maintaining morale during years of brutal warfare required attention to psychological needs. Music was part of that effort. Reason 75. The Soviet promotion system eventually rewarded battlefield competence. Early in the war, political connections mattered more than ability. But as casualties mounted, the Red Army couldn't afford to promote incompetent officers. By 1943, battlefield performance was the primary criterion for promotion. Officers who showed tactical skill and leadership advanced rapidly. This meritocratic approach created a more effective officer corps. Dead weight was weeded out, and talented leaders rose to command. Reason 76. The Soviet forces learned to fight at night as well as during the day. Night operations became routine for Soviet forces. They would attack at night to avoid German air support and artillery observation. Night movement allowed them to reposition forces without being detected. Soviet troops practiced operating in darkness and developed techniques for maintaining coordination without visual signals. This 24-hour operational tempo exhausted German defenders who couldn't rest. Reason 77. The Soviet artillery preparation before major offensives was overwhelming. Before launching an attack, the Soviet artillery would bombard German positions for hours.
Thousands of guns would fire simultaneously. The ground would shake from the explosions. German trenches collapsed. Communication lines were cut. Defenders were killed or stunned. When Soviet infantry advanced, they often encountered dazed survivors rather than organized resistance. This artillery preparation was a signature Soviet tactic that proved devastatingly effective. Reason 78. Soviet forces became experts at forest warfare. Much of the Eastern Front involved forests. Soviet troops learned to move through woods, set ambushes, and fight in limited visibility. Forest fighting negated German advantages in tanks and aircraft. Soviet infantry could get close to German positions without being detected. They developed tactics for surrounding German strongpoints in forests and attacking from multiple directions simultaneously.
Reason 80. Soviet military hospitals were positioned close to front lines. The closer medical care is to the point of injury, the better survival rates become. Soviet military hospitals were set up just behind the front lines. Wounded soldiers could be treated within hours rather than days. This proximity to combat was dangerous for medical staff, but it saved thousands of lives. German forces often had to transport wounded soldiers much farther to reach hospitals, reducing their survival rates. Reason 81. The Soviet ability to rebuild destroyed infrastructure rapidly was remarkable. When the Germans retreated, they destroyed everything. Bridges, railway stations, factories, all demolished. Soviet reconstruction crews would move in immediately and start rebuilding. They would have temporary bridges up within days. Railway lines would be operational within weeks. This reconstruction capability allowed Soviet offensives to maintain momentum. Armies need supplies, and supplies move on roads and railways. Reason 83. Soviet military dogs were trained for various combat roles. The Soviets trained dogs to lay mines, carry messages, and even attack tanks. Anti-tank dogs carried explosives and were trained to run under vehicles. While this specific use proved problematic, military dogs did perform reconnaissance, guard duty, and casualty search missions effectively. Dogs could navigate terrain that stopped vehicles and detect enemies by scent. These animals contributed to Soviet military operations in ways that freed up human personnel. Reason 84. The Soviet chemical troops cleared contaminated areas and created smoke screens. Chemical troops weren't just prepared for gas warfare. They also used smoke generators to obscure Soviet troop movements and river crossings. Smoke screens prevented German artillery observers from directing accurate fire. These troops also handled decontamination procedures and flame weapons. Their specialized training added capabilities that conventional infantry lacked. Reason 85. The Soviet military translators and interpreters facilitated intelligence gathering.
Reason 85. The Soviet aviation navigation training improved bombing accuracy. Early in the war, Soviet bombers struggled to hit targets at night, but navigation training improved. Radio navigation aids were deployed. Pathfinder aircraft marked targets. By 1944, Soviet bombers could conduct effective night operations against German rear areas. They bombed supply depots, marshalling yards, and troop concentrations. This disrupted German logistics and prevented them from massing forces effectively. Reason 86. The Soviet amphibious vehicles expanded operational options. The Soviets used amphibious vehicles to cross rivers without waiting for bridges.
These weren't sophisticated machines, but they worked. Units could cross water obstacles quickly, maintaining offensive momentum. The Germans would often establish defensive lines along rivers, expecting natural barriers to delay Soviet advances. Amphibious capability negated this advantage and kept Soviet attacks moving forward. Reason 87. The Soviet military police maintained order in rear areas. Military police controlled traffic, prevented desertion, and maintained discipline in rear areas. This wasn't glamorous work, but it was necessary. Thousands of vehicles needed to move along limited roads without creating massive traffic jams. Military police directed traffic, controlled movement, and ensured supplies reached the front. Without this organization, Soviet logistics would have collapsed into chaos. Reason 88. The Soviet forces developed effective counter-sniper tactics. German snipers were a serious threat. Soviet forces developed dedicated counter-sniper teams who hunted enemy snipers. They used spotters, coordinated fire, and careful observation to locate and eliminate German sharpshooters. Counter-sniper operations reduced casualties and allowed Soviet troops to move more freely. This specialized warfare required patience and skill, but it paid off in reduced losses. Reason 89. The Soviet system of military tribunals for captured collaborators was swift. Soviet citizens who collaborated with the Germans faced immediate military justice. These tribunals were harsh and often resulted in executions. This brutality sent a clear message: collaboration would not be forgiven. The policy was ruthless, but it discouraged Soviet citizens in occupied areas from actively helping the Germans.
Reason 90. Soviet construction battalions built fortifications and fieldworks. Construction battalions dug trenches, built bunkers, and created defensive positions. When Soviet forces went on the defensive, construction troops would create elaborate fortification systems in days. These weren't permanent structures, but they were effective. Construction battalions also built roads, airfields, and storage facilities. Their labor was essential to supporting combat operations. Reason 91. The Soviet military postal service maintained communication with home. Soldiers could send and receive letters. This connection to home maintained morale during long deployments. Letters from family reminded soldiers what they were fighting for. The Postal Service also served intelligence purposes, as sensors monitored correspondence or signs of poor morale or security breaches. Maintaining this connection between front and home was psychologically important. Reason 92. Soviet forces learned to fight effectively in swamps and wetlands. Large portions of the Eastern Front included swamps where vehicle movement was impossible. Soviet infantry developed techniques for moving through wetlands and fighting in water. They used boats and rafts to transport supplies. Fighting in swamps was miserable, but Soviet forces adapted. German units often avoided swampy terrain, allowing Soviet forces to infiltrate through areas the Germans considered impassable. Reason 93. The Soviet tank army formation created operational breakthrough capability. Tank armies were massive formations containing multiple tank and mechanized corps. These armies could exploit breakthroughs and advance deep into German rear areas. Once Soviet infantry created a gap in German lines, a tank army would pour through and race forward. These formations operated almost independently, with their own logistics and artillery. They were the hammer that smashed German defensive lines.
Reason 94. Soviet military meteorologists provided weather forecasts for operations. Weather affects military operations enormously. Soviet meteorological services provided forecasts that allowed commanders to plan operations. Knowing when rain would turn roads to mud or when clear weather would allow air operations helped Soviet commanders choose optimal timing for attacks. This information advantage, combined with German reliance on predictions rather than systematic forecasting, gave the Soviets better operational planning. Reason 95. The Soviet military censorship system maintained operational security. Letters home were censored. Soldiers couldn't discuss unit locations, strengths, or operations. This prevented intelligence from reaching German forces through captured correspondence. The censorship was intrusive, but it protected operational security. German intelligence often struggled to determine where Soviet forces would attack next because information discipline was strictly enforced. Reason 96. The Soviet military developed effective techniques for clearing minefields. Mines were everywhere on the Eastern Front. Soviet engineers used mine detectors, probes, and explosive charges to clear paths through minefields. They marked cleared lanes and guided troops through safely. Minefield clearing was incredibly dangerous work with high casualty rates. But without this capability, Soviet offensives would have stalled repeatedly. The engineers who cleared mines saved thousands of lives. Reason 97. The Soviet cavalry mechanized groups combined mobility and firepower. In the vast open spaces of the Eastern Front, cavalry still had uses. The Soviets created cavalry mechanized groups that combined horse cavalry with tanks and motorized infantry. These formations could move quickly through varied terrain, exploiting breakthroughs and conducting deep raids. They weren't as powerful as tank armies, but they were more flexible and could operate in areas where purely mechanized forces struggled. Reason 98. The Soviet military journalism documented the war for domestic audiences. Military journalists traveled with units and wrote stories about battles and heroic soldiers. These stories appeared in military newspapers and civilian publications. The journalism wasn't objective, but it wasn't supposed to be. It was propaganda designed to maintain support for the war effort. The stories emphasized Soviet victories and German defeats. This shaped public perception and maintained morale on the home front. Reason 99. The Soviet military ability to concentrate forces at decisive points was unmatched. Soviet commanders became masters of concentration. They would secretly mass enormous forces in a single sector, then launch an overwhelming attack. The Germans often knew an attack was coming, but couldn't determine where. Soviet deception, combined with the ability to move and supply huge armies, created situations where German defenders faced impossible odds. Breaking through at one point was enough to collapse entire sectors of the German front. Reason 100. The Soviet military adaptability allowed them to learn faster than the Germans. The Red Army made terrible mistakes in 1941 and 1942, but they learned. They studied what worked and what didn't. They adapted German tactics and developed counters. They promoted competent commanders and sidelined failures. By 1944, Soviet operational art was arguably more sophisticated than German methods. The Germans kept doing what had worked in 1941, expecting different results. The Soviets evolved.
Reason 101. The Soviet people's determination to survive was unbreakable. This is the factor that ties everything else together. The Soviet Union should have collapsed in 1941. By every rational calculation, they should have lost. Their losses were unsustainable. Their situation was hopeless. But they didn't quit. Factory workers lived in unheated barracks and worked 16-hour shifts. Civilians endured starvation in besieged cities.
soldiers fought to the death in hopeless positions. This wasn't because Soviet people loved Stalin or believed in communism. It was because they understood what German occupation meant. The Nazis weren't conquerors interested in ruling subject peoples. They were exterminators planning to depopulate Eastern Europe. Soviet citizens knew that surrender meant death, so they fought. That determination, multiplied across 200 million people, created an unstoppable force. The Soviet victory in World War II wasn't about any single factor. It was the combination of everything we've discussed. Geography gave them space to retreat. Industry gave them weapons. Manpower gave them soldiers. Experience gave them skill. But none of that would have mattered without the willingness to pay an unimaginable price. 27 million Soviet citizens died in World War II. That number is almost incomprehensible. For context, the United States lost about 400,000 people in the entire war. The Soviet Union lost more people in the siege of Leningrad than the United States lost in the entire war. They lost more people in the Battle of Stalingrad than Britain lost in the entire war. The scale of Soviet sacrifice was unlike anything else in human history. The question isn't really how the Soviet Union won World War II. The question is whether any other nation on Earth could have survived what they endured and still kept fighting. Britain came close to defeat in 1940 and had to rely on American aid to continue. France surrendered in 6 weeks. Poland lasted a month. The Soviet Union lost more territory, more people, and more resources than any of these countries, and they still won. German planning assumed the Soviet Union would behave like a normal nation. A normal nation would have sued for peace after losing millions of soldiers. A normal nation would have collapsed after losing major cities and industrial centers. A normal nation would have negotiated when faced with total destruction. But the Soviet Union wasn't normal. They had nowhere to negotiate from. German policy in occupied areas was so brutal that Soviet citizens knew collaboration meant death. German racial ideology meant there was no possibility of a negotiated peace. Hitler wanted to exterminate the Slavic peoples and colonize their lands. When the choice is fight or die, people fight.
The Soviet victory was bought with blood. Soviet tanks advanced over the bodies of their own soldiers. Soviet offensive succeeded because commanders were willing to accept casualties that would have ended the war for any other nation. This wasn't bravery or heroism in the traditional sense. It was desperation backed by ruthless leadership, willing to spend lives like ammunition. But it worked. By 1945, the Red Army was the most powerful land force on the planet. Soviet tanks surrounded Berlin. Soviet artillery shelled the Reichstag. The hammer and sickle flag flew over the ruins of Hitler's capital. The Third Reich, which was supposed to last 1,000 years, lasted 12. The master race was defeated by the people they considered subhuman. The unbeatable Wehrmacht was crushed by an army they dismissed as incompetent. History doesn't reward virtue. History rewards results. The Soviet Union achieved the result they needed. They survived. They pushed the invaders back, they destroyed the German army, they ended the Nazi regime. The cost was horrific, but the alternative was extinction. Every Soviet citizen who died in that war died to prevent something worse. That's not propaganda or sentimentality, that's historical fact. German occupation meant systematic murder, starvation, and enslavement. Soviet citizens knew this because they saw it happen in occupied territories. They had no illusions about what they were fighting against. The Soviet victory in World War II was inevitable only in hindsight. In 1941, everyone expected them to lose. In 1942, their survival still seemed unlikely. Even in 1943, after Stalingrad and Kursk, complete victory was far from certain. But each year, the Red Army got stronger while the Wehrmacht got weaker.
Each year, Soviet industry produced more weapons while German production struggled. Each year, Soviet soldiers gained experience while German veterans died and couldn't be replaced. The turning point wasn't a single battle. It was the cumulative effect of every factor we've discussed: geography, industry, manpower, leadership, tactics, weapons, logistics, intelligence, and, above all, determination. These factors combined into something the Germans couldn't stop. Hitler believed he could win a war of annihilation. He discovered too late that the Soviet Union could fight that kind of war better than Germany. When you're fighting for survival, you'll do whatever it takes. Germany was fighting for conquest. The Soviet Union was fighting for existence. Those aren't equivalent motivations. The Soviet victory in World War II reshaped the entire world. The Cold War emerged directly from Soviet territorial gains in Eastern Europe. The nuclear age began because both superpowers needed deterrence. The modern world exists because the Soviet Union stopped Nazi Germany. This doesn't excuse Soviet atrocities or Stalin's crimes, but it explains why understanding this history matters.
The 101 reasons we've covered today aren't equally important. Some mattered more than others, but together they explain how a nation that should have been defeated survived and won. They explain how the Wehrmacht, which conquered most of Europe, was destroyed on the Eastern Front. They explain why history took the path it did. Military historians will debate these factors forever. Some will emphasize Soviet mistakes and argue the Germans defeated themselves. Others will focus on Lend-Lease and suggest the Western Allies deserve more credit. But the fundamental reality is simple. The Soviet Union faced the majority of the German military for 4 years and won. They paid the highest price of any nation in the war, and their victory was decisive. The lessons from this history are important. Geography matters in warfare. Industrial capacity determines who can sustain long conflicts. Population size provides strategic depth. Training and experience eventually trump initial advantages. Morale and determination can compensate for material disadvantages. These aren't comfortable lessons because they suggest that winning wars require sacrifices most modern nations would refuse to make. The Soviet experience in World War II was unique. No other nation fought that kind of war. No other nation paid that kind of price. No other nation emerged victorious from that kind of devastation. Whether this makes the Soviet Union admirable or just fortunate is a question every person has to answer for themselves. But the historical facts are clear. They were invaded by the most powerful military in the world. They lost more people than anyone else, and they won. Understanding how they won requires looking at military factors, economic factors, political factors, and human factors. The 101 reasons we've discussed cover all of these areas. None of them alone explain Soviet victory, but together they paint a picture of why the outcome turned out the way it did. The Soviet Union in 1945 was not the same nation that was invaded in 1941. It had been transformed by war into something harder, stronger, and more capable. That transformation came at a cost no one would willingly pay, but it achieved the objective of survival. The veterans of the Great Patriotic War, as the Soviets called it, carried scars for the rest of their lives. Millions never came home. Millions more came home damaged physically and psychologically. The Soviet Union recovered from the war, but it never fully healed. The trauma of those 4 years shaped Soviet society for generations. Every family lost someone. Every city had memorials to the dead. The war became central to Soviet identity in ways that outsiders struggle to understand. Today, you can visit battlefields where these events happened. You can walk through trenches at Kursk. You can see bunkers around Leningrad. You can stand in the ruins of Stalingrad, now called Volgograd.
These places are memorials to what happened. The soil itself is saturated with history. Standing in these locations makes the scale of the conflict real in ways that books and documentaries can't match. The distances are vast, the landscapes are harsh, the climate is brutal. Understanding why the Germans failed requires experiencing these places, even briefly. The Soviet victory in World War II was earned in these fields, forests, and cities. It was earned by soldiers who fought impossible odds. It was earned by workers who built weapons under terrible conditions. It was earned by civilians who endured occupation, starvation, and terror. The price was paid in blood, suffering, and loss. But the result was victory. The Nazi regime was destroyed. The German military was crushed. The war was won. These 101 reasons explain how that happened. They don't justify the cost or romanticize the suffering. They just explain the historical reality of how a nation fought and won the most destructive war in human history. This history matters because it shaped the world we live in today. The Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore, but its victory in World War II still echoes through modern geopolitics, military doctrine, and cultural memory. The soldiers who fought this war are mostly gone now. The last veterans are in their 90s or older. Soon, there will be no one left who experienced these events firsthand. That makes documenting and understanding this history even more important. We need to know what happened, how it happened, and why it happened. Not to glorify war, but to understand the full scope of human experience. The Second World War was the defining event of the 20th century. The Soviet role in that war was central to its outcome. Understanding that role means grappling with uncomfortable truths about what nations will do when faced with existential threats. The 101 reasons we've covered today are just the beginning. Each one could be expanded into hours of discussion. Each battle mentioned involved thousands of individual stories. Each statistic represents real human lives. The numbers are so large they become abstract. 27 million dead stops being comprehensible. It becomes just another statistic. But behind each number was a person with hopes, dreams, and people who loved them. The human cost of this victory can never be fully calculated because we can't measure loss on that scale.
What we can measure is the military outcome. The Soviet Union went from the brink of defeat to crushing victory in 4 years. They rebuilt their military from scratch while simultaneously fighting for survival. They learned from defeats and adapted faster than their enemy. They developed weapons, tactics, and operational art that dominated the battlefield. They coordinated operations across continental distances involving millions of troops. They sustained offensives that drove from Moscow to Berlin. These are measurable achievements that demonstrate military capability. But capability without will accomplishes nothing. The Soviet will to fight, born from desperate necessity, was the foundation of everything else. All the tanks, planes, and artillery in the world wouldn't have mattered if Soviet soldiers weren't willing to use them. All the tactical brilliance would have failed if Soviet citizens weren't willing to endure hardship. The weapons and tactics we've discussed were tools. The Soviet people were the force that wielded those tools to achieve victory. So when we ask how the Soviet Union won World War II, the ultimate answer is simple. They won because they refused to lose. They won because losing meant extinction. They won because they were willing to pay any price to survive. They won because the alternative was unthinkable. That determination, combined with the 101 factors we've discussed, created an unstoppable force that crushed Nazi Germany and changed the course of history forever. If you made it this far, check out what happened when the Allies invaded Normandy.